The Haunting of Hollow Creek. The small town of Hollow Creek was as picturesque as it was forgotten. Nestled deep in the mountains, it was a place that time seemed to have overlooked. The old Victorian houses, with their peeling paint and sagging roofs, stood as monuments to a bygone era. The townsfolk went about their lives with a quiet resignation, their faces lined with the weight of secrets and sorrows that they never spoke of. Hannah Grayson had inherited the old family home on the outskirts of town. It was a sprawling, two-story house that had been in the Grayson family for generations. She remembered spending summers there as a child, playing in the vast, untamed garden and exploring the dusty rooms filled with antique furniture and forgotten trinkets. But those memories were tinged with a sense of unease, as if the house itself had always been watching her. Now, years later, Hannah had returned to Hollow Creek, seeking solace after a messy divorce. She needed a fresh start, and the house seemed like the perfect place to find it. As she drove through the town, she couldn't help but notice the way the locals watched her with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something darker. She pulled up to the house just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the sound of the creek that ran behind the property was a constant, soothing murmur. Hannah took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. The house loomed before her, its windows dark and empty. She walked up the creaking steps to the front porch and fumbled with the old, rusted key. The door swung open with a groan, revealing the dim interior. Dust motes danced in the fading light, and the air was cool and stale. Hannah flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. With a sigh, she realized she would have to check the fuse box in the basement. She set her bags down in the hallway and made her way to the kitchen, where she remembered the basement door being. As she opened the door, a chill ran down her spine. The darkness beyond seemed to pulse with a life of its own. She shook off the feeling and descended the creaky wooden steps, her footsteps echoing in the confined space. The basement smelled of damp earth and mold, and the only light came from the small, grimy window near the ceiling. Hannah found the fuse box and flipped the main switch. The lights flickered on, casting harsh shadows on the concrete walls. She turned to go back upstairs when something caught her eye. A small, wooden door in the far corner of the basement that she didn't remember being there before. Curiosity piqued. She walked over to the door. It was old and weathered with a large iron lock. She tugged on it, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, she decided to leave it for another day and headed back upstairs to start unpacking. As she settled into her new home, Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The house creaked and groaned, and she often thought she heard faint whispers just at the edge of her hearing. She dismissed it as the house settling and her imagination running wild, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. That night, Hannah lay in her old childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling. The familiar sounds of the creek and the rustling of the trees outside should have been comforting, but instead, they only heightened her sense of unease. She tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her. Just as she was about to drift off to sleep, a loud thud echoed through the house, followed by a low, mournful wail. She sat bolt upright, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened intently, but the sounds didn't come again. Determined to prove to herself that it was nothing, she got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight from her nightstand. She crept through the dark house, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the gloom. She checked each room, finding nothing out of place. As she descended the stairs, the temperature seemed to drop, and she could see her breath in the air. She shivered and wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a growing sense of dread. When she reached the basement door, she hesitated. The memory of the small, locked door in the basement flashed through her mind. She steeled herself and opened the door, descending the steps once more. The basement was just as cold and damp as before, and the old wooden door seemed to beckon to her. She approached it cautiously, half expecting something to burst out at her, but the door remained still and silent. She tried the lock again, but it still wouldn't budge. Frustrated and unnerved, she turned to go back upstairs when she heard a soft, scraping sound behind her. She whipped around, shining the flashlight on the door. It was ajar, the lock hanging loosely from the latch. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached out and pulled the door open. The smell of decay and rot hit her like a physical blow, and she gagged, covering her mouth with her hand. Beyond the door was a narrow passageway, leading into darkness. She hesitated, but her curiosity got the better of her. She stepped inside, the flashlight beam illuminating the rough stone walls and dirt floor. The air was thick with dust and the stench of something long dead. The passageway twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the earth. She had no idea how long she walked, but it felt like hours. Just as she was about to turn back, she came to a small, circular room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with strange, ancient artifacts, rusty tools, cracked pottery, and faded photographs. In the center of the room was a large stone altar. It was covered in dark stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Hannah's flashlight flickered, and she banged it against her palm, trying to get it to work. The light steadied, and she stepped closer to the altar. As she examined it, she noticed something strange. A small, ornate box, carved with intricate symbols. She reached out and picked it up, feeling a sudden surge of cold run through her body. The box was surprisingly heavy, and she could feel something moving inside it. Her hands trembled as she opened the box, revealing a collection of old, yellowed bones. They were small, like those of a child. Horrified, she dropped the box, and it clattered to the floor, the bones scattering across the dirt. A low, guttural growl echoed through the room, and she spun around, her flashlight flickering wildly. She saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Panic surged through her, and she turned and ran, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she raced back through the passageway. She burst out of the basement and slammed the door behind her, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stumbled up the stairs and into the living room, her mind reeling with what she had seen. She knew she had to get out of the house, but something inside her wouldn't let her leave. Over the next few days, Hannah tried to go about her life as normally as possible. She busied herself with unpacking and fixing up the house, but the sense of unease never left her. She couldn't stop thinking about the basement and the strange artifacts she had found. She decided to do some research on the house and its history. She went to the local library and spent hours poring over old newspapers and records. What she found only deepened her sense of dread. The house had a long history of strange occurrences and tragedies. In the early 1900s, the house had belonged to a man named William Grayson, a distant relative of Hannah's. According to the records, William had been a respected doctor in the town, but he had become obsessed with the occult. He had conducted strange rituals in the basement, trying to communicate with the dead. There were numerous reports of people going missing in the area, and many believed that William was involved. But before he could be brought to justice, he had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a legacy of fear and suspicion. Hannah couldn't help but wonder if William's experiments had something to do with the strange occurrences in the house. She felt a growing sense of urgency to uncover the truth, but she also knew that she was playing with forces she didn't fully understand. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard the sound of footsteps outside her door. She sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps stopped, and she listened intently, straining to hear anything else. The silence was oppressive, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The doorknob rattled. Desperate for answers, Hannah decided to visit the local historian, a woman named Margaret Haversham. Margaret was known in Hollow Creek for her extensive knowledge of the town's history and its many dark secrets. If anyone could shed light on the mysteries of the Grayson house, it was her. Hannah found Margaret's home at the end of a narrow, winding lane, surrounded by dense woods. The house was small and unassuming, with a well-tended garden blooming with flowers. She knocked on the door, feeling a mix of hope and trepidation. Margaret opened the door, her sharp blue eyes studying Hannah with keen interest. She was an elderly woman, but there was a vitality about her that belied her age. She invited Hannah inside, leading her to a cozy sitting room filled with books and antiques. "What brings you to my doorstep, Miss Grayson?" Margaret asked, her voice warm yet probing. Hannah explained her situation, recounting the strange occurrences in the house and the disturbing discoveries in the basement. Margaret listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying nothing until Hannah had finished. "I've heard many stories about that house," Margaret said finally, her tone somber. "Your ancestor, William Grayson, was a troubled man. His fascination with the occult led him down a dark path. It's said that he was trying to unlock the secrets of life and death, to find a way to bring back those who had passed on." Hannah shivered at the thought. "Do you think he succeeded?" Margaret's eyes darkened. "If he did, it came at a terrible price. The house has been plagued by misfortune ever since. People who enter that house often speak of seeing apparitions, hearing voices, and feeling an oppressive presence. Some have even claimed to have been physically harmed." Hannah's heart sank. "What can I do? I can't live like this, but I also can't just leave." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "There may be a way to put the spirits to rest, but it will not be easy. You must be willing to face the darkness head-on and confront whatever it is that William Grayson summoned." Hannah felt a surge of determination. "I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what I need to do." Margaret nodded. "Very well. You'll need to perform a ritual to cleanse the house. It's a dangerous task, but it may be the only way to break the curse. You'll need to gather certain items: sage for purification, salt for protection, and a black candle to represent the banishment of evil. And there's one more thing. You'll need to find William's journal. It contains the details of the rituals he performed, and it may hold the key to undoing his work." Hannah's resolve wavered at the thought of delving deeper into the house's dark history, but she knew she had no choice. She thanked Margaret and promised to return with the items she needed. As she drove back to the house, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would find the journal, perform the ritual, and free the house from its haunting. Back at the house, Hannah began her search for William Grayson's journal. She started in the library, a room filled with dusty books and old papers. She pulled books from the shelves, rifling through their pages in search of any clue. Hours passed and her frustration grew. Just as she was about to give up, she noticed a loose floorboard near the fireplace. She pried it up, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Hannah's hands trembled as she opened it, revealing page after page of dense, meticulous handwriting. The journal detailed William's descent into madness, his experiments growing darker and more desperate. He wrote of his attempts to contact the dead, to summon spirits and bind them to his will. As she read, Hannah felt a chill settle over her. The last entries were the most disturbing, filled with frantic scrawls and desperate pleas. One entry caught her eye. "The final ritual will be tonight. I have prepared the altar and gathered the necessary items. If I succeed, I will unlock the secrets of life and death. If I fail, may God have mercy on my soul." Hannah knew this was the key to understanding what had happened in the house. She read the instructions for the ritual, noting the items William had used. She realized with a sinking feeling that many of the items were still in the basement, in the small room she had discovered. Armed with this knowledge, she gathered the sage, salt, and black candle Margaret had mentioned. She steeled herself for what she knew would be the most difficult part: returning to the basement and confronting whatever it was that William had unleashed. The house was eerily silent as Hannah made her way to the basement. She felt a sense of foreboding, as if the house itself was aware of her intentions and was trying to stop her. She descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. When she reached the basement, she saw that the small wooden door was ajar once more. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside, clutching the journal and her supplies. The room was just as she had left it, the altar standing in the center like a grim sentinel. She set up the items for the ritual, arranging them as William's journal instructed. She lit the black candle and began to chant the words written in the journal, her voice trembling but resolute. The air seemed to thicken, and she felt a pressure building around her. As she continued the chant, The shadows in the room began to move, coalescing into a dark figure. It was the same figure she had seen in the doorway, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It moved toward her, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. Hannah's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to continue the ritual. She sprinkled the salt in a circle around her, creating a barrier of protection. The figure hissed and recoiled, but it didn't retreat. It seemed to be growing stronger, feeding off her fear. She took the sage and began to burn it, waving the smoke toward the figure. "By the power of this ritual, I banish you from this place," she shouted, her voice gaining strength. "Return to the darkness from whence you came." The figure shrieked, a sound that pierced Hannah's ears and filled her with dread. It lunged at her, but the barrier of salt held. The candle flickered and almost went out, but she shielded it with her hand, refusing to let the darkness win. With one final, desperate effort, she completed the chant, her voice echoing in the confined space. The figure writhed and contorted, its form breaking apart. It let out one last, anguished cry before it dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only an oppressive silence. Hannah collapsed to the floor, her strength drained. She felt a strange calm settle over her, as if the house itself was finally at peace. She knew that the battle was over, but the scars it had left on her soul would take time to heal. In the days that followed, Hannah slowly began to reclaim her life. The house, once filled with shadows and whispers, now felt warm and inviting. She threw open the windows, letting in the fresh air and sunlight. The sense of dread that had hung over her was gone, replaced by a feeling of hope. She visited Margaret to thank her for her guidance and to tell her what had happened. Margaret listened with a mixture of awe and respect, her eyes shining with pride. "You have done a great thing, Hannah," she said. "You have freed your family and this town from a terrible curse." Hannah smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. "I couldn't have done it without your help. Thank you, Margaret." As she walked through the town, she noticed that the townsfolk seemed to regard her with a new sense of respect. The weight of the house's dark history had been lifted, and for the first time, Hollow Creek felt like a place of possibility rather than fear. Hannah decided to stay in the house, turning it into a home filled with love and light. She tended to the garden, repaired the old furniture, and filled the rooms with laughter and joy. The shadows of the past had been banished, and the future was bright. Years later, as Hannah sat on the porch, watching the sun set over Hollow Creek, she thought about the journey she had taken. The house that had once been a source of fear and darkness had become a sanctuary. She had faced the horrors of the past and emerged stronger for it. She had also discovered a new passion for history, inspired by Margaret's dedication. She began to document the stories of Hollow Creek, preserving the memories of those who had come before. She wanted future generations to know the truth, to understand the importance of facing the past and embracing the light. And so, the story of the haunting of Hollow Creek became a legend, a tale of courage and redemption. Hannah's name became synonymous with bravery and resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. As the years passed, the house stood as a testament to her strength, a beacon of light in a world that had once been shrouded in darkness. And in the heart of Hollow Creek, the memory of the haunting faded, replaced by a legacy of love and light that would endure for generations to come.